Welcome to the 13th podcast of Traditional Lies, where we research the original Hebrew text to reveal the incomplete translation of the King James Bible. This is part two of a three-part podcast where we are searching out Jonah chapter 1, verse 3. A summary of part one is we learned that Jonah's name is transliterated, and the translation of his name is dove. We also learned his father's name, Amittai, is transliterated and means my truth. And we learned that Jonah is from Gath Hefer, a town a few miles northeast of Nazareth, and that Jonah is the only Galilean prophet in the Old Testament. In part one, we searched out the Hebrew word translated as a ship and proved that it actually means I am to be revealed. We'll see the impact of that on this verse as we continue. Now we're ready for part two. The first thing we want to reveal in part two is that the first Hebrew word of this verse is translated as but rose up. This word occurs 128 times in the original text and is correctly translated in the other occurrences as and rose up. The first letter of this word is the vav. The vav is always translated as the word and so we can replace the implied beginning of disobedience with the word but and remove that implication and replace it with the word and. Now we're ready to look at the word translated as to flee in Jonah 1:3. And the first thing to recognize is it only occurs four times in the original text. And the last two occurrences, the third and the fourth occurrences, are in the book of Jonah. Let's search out the second occurrence of this word in Exodus chapter 36, verse 33. It says, and he made the middle bar to shoot through the board from the one end to the other. Now, wait a minute. This is a board. This bar is going through some boards, and this is an inanimate object. This object doesn't have life. It's an object. And this word that we're translating as to flee and giving the characteristic of sinful disobedience is being applied to an inanimate object. Okay, so immediately we learn that the Hebrew text is openly declaring that sinful disobedience is an impossibility. It is impossible for this word to imply sinful disobedience. How quickly this podcast is going to continue, but you need to look at this as much as necessary to rid yourself of the ideas of things taught in our past in a traditional story that this word implies rebellion and disobedience. So now to prove this, we're going to look at the other occurrences of this word. Let's go to the first occurrence of this word, and we find in Genesis 31:27, this is Laban talking to Jacob, who had just left his land with all of his possession and his wives, and he's saying, wherefore didst thou flee away secretly and steal away from me? And he continues. And so now the first occurrence of this word is revealing consistency to what we knew prior to the second occurrence with this middle bar. Once again, we're seeing proof that this word flee implies sinful disobedience. But now let's go research this story and see the truth behind this story that will further show the truth behind the middle bar and the fourth occurrence in podcast number 3. So in Genesis 31, in verse 1, Jacob is hearing about the accusations of Laban's sons. In verse 2, he then sees that Laban's countenance with him has changed. It's not going well. And now Yahweh visits with Jacob and tells Jacob to return to the land of his fathers. And he tells Jacob that he's going to be with him. And so we're looking at this word where Jacob's going to leave, that Laban declares. And now we're seeing that Jacob didn't flee from Laban with rebellious disobedience. He fled and left Laban with the authority of his God and the approval of his God. And his God even declared he would be with him. We're going to look at God's participation in this, what they call fleeing, and see how God's participation in this word changes everything. So notice after in verse 31, it continues telling the story, and Jacob's telling his wives what Yahweh has done, and he's even declaring to them that Laban has changed his wage 10 times. That's pretty cool because we know the number 10 is the it is finished number. And so after changing his wages 10 times, Jacob is leaving with the authority, with the request from his God. All right. And so on the third day after Jacob's gone, Laban finds out he left on the third day. Craziness, right? In verse 24, Laban the Syrian has a dream, and God tells Laban, when you meet Jacob, you better be careful how you talk to him. Don't talk good or bad. Man, that's like a threat. God gave Laban a threat during his sleep in a dream. And so let's look again. We have Laban, not Jacob. Laban is using this word because Laban knows that Jacob has authority. The key here is the first letter, the letter Lamed, which means authority, setting up a government. This word fled, if you remove the Lamed, it is disobedience. But this word flee that Laban is using, Laban knew when he got there, even from the dream, from Jacob's past. Laban knew everything here. Laban is declaring that he is aware that Jacob is leaving with God's authority. And now, in the fourth occurrence of this word, we're going to prove that Jonah left the presence of God to go do the work that God had Jonah to do with God's authority. Jonah didn't leave in sinful disobedience. Jonah left with the authority of his God to do the will of his God to, throughout his entire life. It's going to be an amazing change of how this story reveals the truth about the dove, the son of my truth, the Galilean prophet from the Old Testament. Glory.